Hello, Marty. How you doing today? Everybody, this is Mike Bartels. I'm the Chief Development Officer at Becker LLC. And today I have the pleasure of speaking and interviewing Marty Borosko, who is the Managing Partner and Staff and Practice Leader at Becker LLC. Marty, how are you this morning?
Oh, Mike, I'm great. Good morning to you. Always enjoy getting up early and chatting with you. I guess it's not that early, but nonetheless, always enjoy chatting with you in the morning.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about the Becker Staff and Practice?
Sure. Becker has one of the largest staffing practices in the country. We represent over 100 human capital management brands. Those companies that we work with really represent the spectrum of the human capital management industry, from individual sectors to technology and not technology focused. Our practice is pretty varied. We have 9 attorneys at the firm who are dedicated to the staffing industry practice. I'm the practice leader. I spend 100% of my time, and I mean that 100% of my time, working on matters for our staffing and human capital management clients.
Great. That's great. So today we're going to do a deep dive into the SBA questionnaire in regards to PPP forgiveness. My first question I want to jump into with you, Marty, is has there been any new developments for the audit process in regards to borrowers who are going over the $2 million threshold?
Yes, very recently, about on Halloween, actually around that time frame, the SBA came out with its questionnaire that it's going to be sending to borrowers who borrowed over $2 million in the program. That questionnaire is the foundation of the audit program that the SBA is going to put in place. And it's quite detailed. It is surprising in some instances. And it's something that borrowers over $2 million have to take very, very seriously.
Okay. Let's start with when you're a staffing company and you just received the loan assessment questionnaire from the SBA because your loan was over the $2 million. What are the first steps that should be taken?
Hey, Mike, we might have to start over.
This is Mike Bartels. I am the Chief Development Officer at Becker LLC. And this morning I have the pleasure of interviewing Marty Borosko, who is a staffing practice leader and managing partner at Becker LLC. Marty, how are you today?
Good morning, Mike. It's great to talk to you, and I look forward to our chat today.
This is fantastic. Why don't you tell me about the Becker practice in regards to human capital management and staffing?
Sure. Becker has one of the largest practices in the country. We have 9 attorneys who are dedicated to the practice. We represent over 100 brands in the industry, and our clients really mirror the industry in general. We have clients who are very niche players in certain industry segments, to clients who are very broad, large players who cover many different industry segments. We have small startups to very established companies. And, we handle both their strategic and operational legal needs, and our 9 attorneys dedicated to that practice all focus on areas that are very specific and important to the human capital management and staffing industry.
That's fantastic. So today we're going to be discussing the SBA's questionnaire in regards to PPP forgiveness in particular. Has there been any new developments for the audit process for borrowers who exceed the $2 million threshold?
Yes, a very big development 2 weeks ago, and I believe it was around Halloween that the SBA came out with the questionnaire that you referenced. That's going to become one of the centerpieces of its audit program for borrowers who borrowed over $2 million a year. And it's quite an in-depth questionnaire. It is surprising in certain areas to me. And it's something that borrowers over $2 million need to take very seriously in terms of filling it out and submitting it to the SBA.
Okay. Well, let's start with receiving the loan necessity questionnaire from the SBA because your loan was over the $2 million threshold. What are the first steps that should be taken in regards to this notice?
Well, I'm going to say this, Mike. The steps with regard to this notice need to take place before you even receive it. And let me explain that and explain why. The notice, when you receive it, you have 10 days to respond. And that's a very short time window given the importance of the notice and the complexity of the notice.
Okay.
So I submit, and I've been counseling all of our clients to start the process of examining this questionnaire, filling out this questionnaire, and preparing this questionnaire now. Don't start it when you receive it. So that, to me, that's step one, is preparing in advance, and starting now. Step two is, how do you go about preparing the questionnaire? And you and I will get into in depth on some of the questions, and I can talk about that. So let me talk about generally how you got to go about preparing for the questionnaire. One is know what your story is. Two is start to gather the documents that support your story. Three is, as I said, preparing in advance, filling out this questionnaire, and looking at your answers, seeing if, where they need supplementing, where they may need explanation. And four is getting your professionals involved, whether it be your accountants or your attorneys or whatever other advisors or trusted advisors you have. They should be involved in reviewing this and helping you put together your response to the questionnaire.
Excellent. In the beginning of the notice, like you said, the recipients are given 10 days to provide the necessary information to the SBA to help them decide whether they're going to be forgiven or not. What documents can PPP loan recipients gather before they potentially receive this notice?
Well, I mean, the questionnaire hits a number of different aspects, which we'll drill down on, but there's two broad themes. One theme is the business impact that the pandemic has had on you. How has it impacted your business? And the other theme is how much access to liquidity does a borrower have to help them kind of bridge any economic difficulties that they experienced because of the pandemic. So given those are the two themes, you need to be gathering the documents that relate to those themes, the documents that show the economic impact and business impact that you experienced as a result of the pandemic, and documents that show and demonstrate what liquidity you had or did not have at the time that you made your PPP loan application.
Okay. Well, it seems like there's two steps to this questionnaire. So can you give us an overview of the questionnaire and what it entails?
Yes, that's exactly right. It's these two themes I just talked about. It's the economic or business impact, and then it's the liquidity assessment. The economic and business impact has a series of questions that are intended to probe whether in fact your business was impacted by the pandemic. And we're going to go through those questions, so we'll get into the specifics, but it's a series of questions aimed at that, along with some opportunities to supplement your questionnaire or your answers with your own information about how you were impacted. Other side of the equation is the liquidity assessment. And again, follows a similar format. There's a series of questions that are aimed at assessing the liquidity that was available to borrowers at the time of the PPP loan. And then again, there's an opportunity to supplement those answers and provide additional information about that liquidity in that part of the questionnaire.
Okay, great. Well, let's start with the business activity assessment portion, because that's really where you're going to begin to tell the entire story. Questions 2 through 5 focus on businesses being shut down for a period of time due to the pandemic. Can you walk us through how staffing firms can address these questions?
Sure. And of course, why we're not focusing on question 1 is because it's more or less a factual inquiry. It's a factual inquiry about your revenue at certain points in time. And so it's pretty straightforward. You're going to have to provide an answer to that question. 2, 3, 4, and 5 are, as you described them, intended to figure out whether and how your business might have been interrupted or shut down based upon the pandemic. So question 2 is, was your business ordered to shut down as a result of some governmental mandate or order that was put in place? So for most staffing firms, that's not going to be the case, right? They may have clients whose businesses were shut down, but that's not technically their business being ordered to be shut down. So for most staffing firms, the answer to number two is going to be no. So then you would move to number three, and that's whether an order, governmental order, significantly altered your operations, right? And so that's where some staffing firms or most staffing firms are probably going to check yes. And then there's a series of sub-questions where they have to explain how long the orders impacted their operations, you know, how it may have particularly impacted their operations in terms of limiting the number of people that could be on site, in terms of having to reconfigure workspaces, things of that nature. And then you go on to number four, and four talks about whether you voluntarily ceased or reduced your operations during COVID-19. Again, that might be apply to some staffing firms, but probably not going to apply to all staffing firms. Number five, which will definitely apply to all staffing firms, looks to have you explain how you reduced your operations, and how you changed your operations and the economic impact that that had, or the economic cost that that had on your business. Okay, so that's questions 2, 3, 4, and 5. What's important about those is each one of those questions contains sub-questions, and at the end, an opportunity to supplement the information that you provided. So it's really important that staffing firms look to take advantage of that opportunity to supplement the answers they provided, because their story may not be fully told. In fact, likely will not be fully told by just answering the sub-questions. To fully tell a compelling story, the staffing firms are going to have to add in additional information at the places that those questions allow them to do that.
I think that's where we jump into question 8, Marty, because that's, from what I've read on it, is that's where they really can get granular in regards to the details of their story. Where should they jump in with question 8? How detailed should they get? How detailed should they not get in regards to question 8?
Right. So that's exactly right, Mike. And that's really good advice, is that staffing firms need to take advantage of the opportunity presented in question 8. Question 8 allows you to add additional comments up to 1,000 characters, describing other impacts that aren't covered in the standard questions, that business activity or economic impacts upon your staffing firm as a result of the pandemic. So what could be in there? That story is going to change, right? And what should be in there is going to change based on the individual circumstances of each staffing firm. But let's give some examples of things that could be put in there that may make a lot of sense for staffing firms, right? If you go back to question 1, they talked about the revenues, and the revenues compare revenues in Q2 of this year to Q2 of 19, right?
Right.
Well, there could be staffing firms, and I bet there are many staffing firms, that when you look at those revenues, Q2 of 19 and Q2 of 20, they might be close, right?
Mm-hmm.
Might in fact be staffing firms that the revenues in Q2 of 20 are better than the revenues of Q2 of 19, right?
Correct.
So at first blush, at first appearance, the SBA might say, holy cow, these people didn't need money because look at their revenues. Their revenues were greater in Q2 of 20 than Q2 of 19, or their revenues were very close and they borrowed $6 million from us and there was only a $200,000 revenue dip between Q2 of 20 and Q2 of 19. Well, you need to tell that story as to why that financial picture isn't telling the SBA why you needed the money, right? So there could be a lot of different stories. There could be, hey, you've been on an incredible growth trend, right? So if you looked at Q3 of 19, Q4 of 19, Q1 of 20, you would see that revenue had been going up and up. And in fact, you might have a case where in Q1 of 20, your revenue, let's give an example, was $3 million, even though in Q2 of 19, it was only $2 million. And so your revenue might in Q2 of 20 have dropped from 3 million to 2.5 million. Okay, well, that's quite a significant drop. And so that could easily create a necessity or an economic impact that necessitated the PPP loan. So you got to look at that. That's an example of explanations you may want to provide. You may want to provide explanations about how your KPI looked in the Q2 of 20, right? And why certain KPI, fill rates, number of orders, time to fill, time for clients to pay invoices, discounts that you may have had to give to your clients to get them to continue to work with you. Those type of KPI might have been telling a story that Q3 and Q4 were very, very concerning to you, even though Q2 of 2020 was still pretty solid. So you really have to look in 8 to tell the story of that supplements the information you gave at the beginning of the questionnaire in this section, and shows the impact on your business and on your business P&L as a result of the pandemic.
That's great, Marty. That's fantastic advice. Let's jump into the liquidity assessment, because this is really, I think, in my opinion, after reading the questionnaire, really, really an important piece of this. In question 1, it asks about the cash and cash equivalents for borrowers and their supporting documents for the last day of the quarter before the PPP application. What should borrowers focus in on, and what equity does not need to be divulged?
Right. So, I think you're right. The liquidity assessment section is, for some staffing firms, going to be the scarier section in terms of filling that out and how to fill that out in a way that tells the right story. And there's some interesting questions that I don't agree should even be part of the inquiry, and therefore some traps that staffing firms have to be aware of. But question 1 isn't one of those traps. It's a pretty straightforward question. They want to look at what type of cash you had on hand as you entered the pandemic, because obviously cash is a form of liquidity that you could use to help bridge any economic impact that the pandemic was going to have on you. So it's pretty straightforward. Question number 1.
Okay. Well, in question number 2, it focuses in on capital distributions to owners. How do you view this type of distribution if using a PPP loan to pay capital distributions to owners, and how do you think it will affect the SBA's view of their forgiveness?
Well, this is one of those questions that, along with question number 5, and I'm going to talk about those 2 questions and answers together, Mike, because they're very, very related. But, question 2, as you said, is about distributions and dividends to owners. Question 5 is about owner compensation above $250,000 per year, right? Okay. So those are the 2 questions aimed at seeing, well, was there liquidity that was going to the owners in form of dividends or distributions and compensation that could have been used to, again, bridge the economic impact or the negative economic impact of the pandemic on your company. And this is something, you've heard me speak on the PPP loan and the audit and what that process may or may not look like. Well, I'm one of those folks who's been speculating, and I don't even know what speculating, virtually guaranteeing that part of the audit process would be an examinations of dividends and distributions and an examination of owner comp. Many people have not talked about the possibility that owner comp would be looked at. And I knew that the SBA was going to do that. And lo and behold, here they are. They're looking at both of those things. So you're going to have to put down in question 2 what distributions went out to owners. And in question 5, you're going to have to answer questions about owners that receive more than $250,000 per year in annual compensation. 2 scary questions for many owners, but there is a light, and when we get to a little bit further into this section of the detail, there is a chance and an opportunity to explain some of your answers in 2 and 5, and to show that there is a good story still to be told, even if there were distributions and even if the owner's comp was above $250,000 a year.
Well, that's ironic, because the next part I want to ask about is section 4, when they ask about any individual employee that were compensated over $250,000 during this period. Now, if this were the case and they met the criteria, how could this potentially affect forgiveness as with an employee? So if you have an employee, say a salesperson, especially in this industry, there's a high chance that a really good one is going to make more than $250,000 if they're a good revenue generator. I want to throw that out at you.
Oh, Mike, you're raising a really important issue, and this is the area when I answered before that I was surprised, and I didn't think there were certain questions that belonged in this assessment, and this is that exact question, right? Because it's one thing for the SBA to say that owner comp, right, whether it be in the form of salary or distributions and dividends, can be considered in determining corporate liquidity, right? That makes sense. You could debate it, but that makes some sense, right?
Right.
But normal employee comp, right, to me is not part of the liquidity equation for a company, right? You're talking about you just gave the best example. If you have a great salesperson who's generating millions of dollars of revenue for your company, if you don't compensate that person, what's going to happen? They're going to say bye-bye. They're gone, right? So for the SBA to be insinuating here that companies should have cut back the salaries of high-earning employees is ridiculous, because the impact that could have had or would have had on staffing firms who needed the PPP loan so that they didn't have to fire lower earning employees, right? That's who this was intended to protect, right? Was the lower earning employees. So, but if a company was faced with the choice of taking a PPP loan and knowing it was going to have to reduce its high earning employees who are high revenue generators and risk losing them, or not take the PPP loan and instead reduce staff considerably, which would have been overwhelmingly the low earning staff, right? What choice would companies have made? They would have made a choice not to accept the PPP loan and to do exactly what Congress didn't want them to do, to continue to lay off and fire low earning employees. So this question is a problem, but it's here. So you're going to have to answer, right, how many employees you have over $250,000 and all the questions about those employees.
That's a really important part of the story, and I think that's where they're going to really have to dig in and be extremely detailed. Staying with the liquidity assessment, Marty, questions 9, 10, and 11 focus on ownership, and in particular, if your staffing company is a subsidiary of a parent company. Now, if 20% or more of your company is owned by a private equity, venture fund, hedge fund, or if the company is an affiliate of a foreign state-owned entity. If this criteria is matched, how does this affect their forgiveness, and how would you perceive the percentage to be allocated?
Well, again, this is a way that the SBA is looking to see if there was other additional access to liquidity. And here they're looking at, well, do you have a corporate affiliation? And was that corporate affiliate somebody who had some assets and liquidity that can be attributed to you and that you theoretically could have used to bridge the economic impact that the pandemic was having on you. And this is also aimed a little bit at some of the bad publicity that the PPP program received in terms of, you know, public, private equity firms, who have been quite profitable, receiving PPP funds, or their investment companies receiving PPP funds. So this is a little bit of a question aimed at maybe placating public opinion. Again, look, you're going to have to answer these questions. You're going to have to provide the information. You're going to have to talk about your corporate structure and where the borrower fits into that corporate structure. And, that's information is going to go to the SBA. And this is, again, another area that, depending on your answers, you're probably going to want to use the opportunity at the end of this section to explain your answers and explain why. Just because you have these affiliations does not mean that you had access to additional liquidity.
Okay. Well, at the end of the business activity assessment, question 8 really gave you a chance to detail your story. And the same under the liquidity assessment, question 13 gives you the opportunity to do a little bit more of a deeper dive to really finish your story on the cash portion. How important do you view that part as well?
That part is absolutely critical, right? Because some of the questions we reviewed on the liquidity assessment are, in my opinion, quite slanted and don't look to develop the entire liquidity picture. For example, there are no questions about available lines of credits, right?
Right.
And the staffing industry, which relies, I'm not going to say exclusively, but almost exclusively on asset-based lines of credit, the pandemic, for the most part, or at least in many cases, did have a negative impact upon staffing firms' ability to access those lines of credit.
Right.
And that is a scary thought and was a scary possibility for staffing firms. And one of the primary reasons why staffing firms needed PPP loans was the fact that the economic impact was greatly reducing their ability to borrow against these asset-based lines of credit. So 13 gives you an opportunity to tell that story, right? I mean, you got to kind of step back because this is taking such a slanted, limited view. You got to step back and understand, what's the principle of working capital, right? Every business needs a certain amount of working capital to operate and survive.
Right.
And so really your liquidity is tied to that your working capital needs, right? You need enough liquidity to meet your working capital needs. Well, working capital needs of each company are very different, right? Smaller companies might have very small working capital needs. Larger companies might have gigantic working capital needs. And this questionnaire up through question 12 of this section doesn't really take a holistic viewpoint of a company's working capital needs and its working capital situation at the time of the pandemic. And that's the story that needs to be told in 13, right? You need to step back and present a holistic picture of your working capital needs at the time of the pandemic and how the pandemic threatened those working capital needs. And you need to provide the documentation and the information that will do that. And that story is going to be slightly different again for every staffing firm. But that's the story that needs to be told in 13 because the first 12 questions, as I said, don't give the holistic picture of really what the liquidity and the working capital needs of a company were at the time of the pandemic.
Marty, 10 days to some may seem like a long time, to others it may not seem like a long time. But when you finish this questionnaire, when management finishes this questionnaire, how important do you view it that they get it done on a timely basis and then submit it to their professionals, let's say their bankers, their accountants, their attorneys, for a topside view so the picture really can be painted accurately and really tell the whole story?
Well, I'm going to go to the certifications to really answer that question. At the end of the questionnaire, the company representative is going to have to attest to certain things, right? One, they have to attest to the fact that they have the authority to sign and bind the borrower to the statements made in the questionnaire. Two, they have to attest to the fact that the material is true and accurate in all material respects, and that they made a reasonable inquiry of all the people, all the systems, and all the information available to the borrower to answer this questionnaire. And three, they have to attest to the fact that they understand that this is being submitted under a threat of perjury, right?
Mhm.
And under the provisions of the SBA regulations that govern penalties for somebody who submits false information to the SBA at any point during an SBA loan process. And those penalties are not traditional slaps on the wrist, right? They are extremely high potential fines, some instances up to $250,000, some instances up to $1 million, and imprisonment. Under one section, you can have up to 2 years of imprisonment. Under another section, up to 30 years of imprisonment. So we're talking about incredibly serious consequences if you don't fill this out accurately, okay? Second, we're talking about serious consequences if you do fill it out accurately, but that the SBA in its audit determines that you weren't a proper borrower, right? And those consequences probably not going to be as severe as not telling the truth and being accurate in this, but still severe. You're going to have to repay that loan, right? It's not going to be forgiven. And you're going to have to do that immediately. So we've got very critical, substantial consequences here. And when you have those type of consequences, you do what I said at the outset. You don't wait till they get this questionnaire. You don't throw together your answer in the 10 days that you have from your receipt of the questionnaire to the time that it has to be filed. And you start that process really early. The questionnaire is available today. Folks should be starting to work on the process of responding to that questionnaire today. And they should be engaging, like I said, their professionals, their accountants, their attorneys, their other strategic advisors who can take an honest look at the questionnaire, look at their answers, and give them unbiased advice on what they may or may not want to consider in changing or in answering these questions.
That's a fantastic advice, Marty. Now, if you're a staffing owner and your application is filed and you get notice that you have been selected by the SBA and you're lucky enough that you're going to have an audit, what are the next steps that management should take, and what would you recommend that they have on hand before the audit happens?
So if you're getting audited, that's because the SBA found some information in the questionnaire you filled out that raised red flags and made the SBA decide that they wanted to dig deeper into the circumstances surrounding your loan application and your need for PPP loans. So you're now at another even more critical stage, right? Because
Right.
the questionnaire is first stage. If they're digging down below that, you've got red flags, right? So you need to, again, the key is to prepare. The key is to bring in your professionals to help you prepare so that you can tell the story to the SBA. If you have your team of professionals and another team of industry professionals, you'll have an opportunity to explain to the SBA particular things about your business and your industry that the SBA is not going to know, right? The SBA is not going to send a staffing industry expert into your office to audit you. I can virtually guarantee that they're going to be sending somebody who may know nothing about the staffing industry, how they operate, what the economics are, what the risks are, right? So you need to be prepared with your team to tell the story of the industry, how it was impacted by the pandemic, and your personal story. And you need to have that all lined up in advance, right? You want to tell your story. You don't want to just play defensive and answer questions. Offense is the best tactic here, right? Get offensive by telling your story, by bringing out the documents, by walking the auditor through the story. Don't sit back and wait for them to ask questions and ask for documents, because then they're filling in their story, and their story you don't want to be filled in, right?
Not at all.
You want to control the story. So that's my advice. And I'm going to go back to my first advice, right? When you get to that stage, your costs of responding are going to be so much higher, right? Anybody who goes to an audit without their professionals is foolish. So you're going to have to engage professionals, accountants and lawyers at that time. And if you hadn't had them involved from the beginning, their ramp up time and the amount of time they're going to have to spend preparing and attending and following up on this audit is going to be substantial. And you could have maybe avoided that if you had taken the time, right, to tell the story the right way on the questionnaire the first time. So this is one of those cases, spend a little bit of extra time, spend a little bit of extra money getting it right the first time, could save you substantial risk and substantial money and resources from an actual audit or that comes after the questionnaire.
Marty, that's incredible advice. That really is. One of the last pieces of this is there's what's called a failure to comply portion in the opening letter. And it clearly states there if you were either ineligible for the loan and that the SBA will be seeking repayment of the loan in full or pursue other remedies. I got two-part question here. What would the repayment possibility look like, loan percentage of payback? And what would you define as other remedies for repayment?
Right. So the loan repayment, if they determine you weren't eligible for loan, is instant, right? You're responsible to pay that loan back instantly. You will get no forgiveness. There's some question as whether there's going to be any interest put on that, and how that interest will run as a penalty, and whether there's going to be any penalties included in that. But at a minimum, you're going to have to instantly pay back that loan. The other penalties get into what I talked about before, Mike, right? They get into that section where there's a whole range of penalties that the SBA can impose, from fines to imprisonment to things of that nature. Back in the spring, when they were issuing their FAQs for the PPP program, it looked like the SBA was walking away from that type of threat of imprisonment and of fines and penalties, and that the big threat that the SBA was going to rely upon to get people to act properly and in good faith was just the repayment threat. This questionnaire raises a huge question as to whether or not that's still the SBA tact. This questionnaire makes it seem as though the SBA has reversed course and now not only is threatening repayment, but is threatening other types of remedies and penalties against staffing firms. So, again, that's why folks need to take this so seriously. There are options, right? If you fill out this questionnaire and you're concerned about what the picture is, there are, as we talked about, ways that you can tell your story that will probably help that. But if you can't tell a good story, and maybe some folks can't tell a good story, well, there may be options too to help reduce your risk. And again, that's where you need your professionals, your accountants, and your attorneys to come in and run through those options for you.
Okay. Well, I want to wrap it up with this last question for you. When you go through this questionnaire, it seems like a lot of it could be doom and gloom and isn't always sunshine. Paint a narrative for us where you can show that it isn't all doom and gloom.
I think that, look, this was a well-intentioned program, and it was uh, just by necessity forced to be put together very quickly by the government. And of course, that's going to lead to some lack of clarity, some concern. But overall, this was a positive program. I think for the large part, staffing firms and other businesses for that matter needed this money. And if they take their time to really put together the right analysis, we'll be able to show the government that they needed this money and they were proper borrowers. So in that respect, for so many people, this is going to be a program that really helped them um, save and continue their business and save employment of their low earning employees, just as the program was intended. There will be a percentage of borrowers who, whether or not they should have borrowed, is a bigger question. And for them, they're going to have some tougher questions to answer. And, you know, for them, I don't know if I'd call it doom or gloom. They're going to have to put in some time, work, and effort to figure out their best approach to this questionnaire and their best approach to forgiveness. And I think it's just as simple as that.
All right, Marty. Well, listen, this was an incredible discussion today, and thank you very much for your insight.
Thanks, Mike. It's good talking to you. And I hope our listeners get some insight from, you know, our discussion today.
Have a great day.